Hello, friends, and let's get started.
When Andrew entered the house, he immediately felt the tension. The evening started as usual. Loud music, clinking glasses, relaxed conversations. The guests had already scattered into the spacious rooms. Some were laughing at the bar. Some were discussing something on the leather sofas. The air was saturated with the tart smell of alcohol, expensive perfume, and faint cigarette smoke wafting in from the backyard. Trevor stood in the center of the living room, leaning casually against the massive drink counter, his dazzling smile immediately apparent. He was in his repertoire, confident, relaxed, master of the situation. As Andrew and Melissa came closer, he straightened, stepped forward, and held out his hand. His fingers closed on Andrew's hand tighter than was customary in a handshake, as if there was more to the gesture than just a greeting. "Good to see you, old man," he said, nodding slightly, but his gaze had already slid to Melissa. "And you." He smiled wider, lingering his gaze on her a little longer than he should have. "I knew you wouldn't let me down." The words were said casually, with that trademark smirk that always made him look like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Andrew frowned, glanced quickly at his wife, but she had already averted her eyes. He noticed how she tensed slightly, how she clenched her fingers imperceptibly, as if trying to suppress some emotion. She didn't answer, only smiled, but it seemed strained, as if there was anxiety underneath. There were guests scurrying around, people passing by, patting each other on the shoulder, people having a good time, but it was that moment, the fleeting exchange of glances, the almost imperceptible gesture, that stuck in Andrew's mind. Trevor, without taking his eyes off Melissa, took 2 drinking glasses, handed one to her, and kept the other. She hesitated for a second, but accepted. Andrew watched this, feeling a strange feeling rise up inside. He'd known Trevor for a long time, knew his habits, his way of acting like the whole world belonged to him. But this time there was something different, something that tugged at his gut. "Relax, buddy," Trevor said suddenly, clapping him on the shoulder as if he'd caught his mood. "Tonight's going to be a great night. I hope you don't mind if I borrow your wife a little. Just steal her away for a few minutes. An old debt, so to speak." The words sounded playful, but something about them made Andrew's jaw clench. He looked at Melissa, expecting her to laugh, to make a joke, but she only nodded, avoiding his gaze. I'll be right there," she said quietly, almost inaudible. Trevor gestured for her to go deeper into the house. He didn't know what was going on, but his gut was screaming that something was wrong. He didn't know, but he could feel it. The noise in the living room grew louder. The guests had finally relaxed, the alcohol had warmed up their blood, and Trevor, like an experienced puppeteer, was gradually bringing everyone to the moment that seemed to be the purpose of the party. Andrew sat in one of the armchairs by the fireplace, pretending to watch with a slight chuckle, but a strange feeling was growing inside him. It wasn't jealousy. It was something deeper, a vague, clammy premonition that could not be dismissed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trevor's voice, loud, confident, cut through the noise, forcing everyone to pay attention to him. "Tonight is a very special night. Let's make it unforgettable." He stood in the center of the room, holding a glass of whiskey in one hand and an empty bottle he had just picked up off the floor in the other. His smile was wide, cocky, almost predatory. "I think we need a game," he continued. "Not just stupid questions or boring toasts. No, tonight we play for real." There was cheering laughter. Someone clapped their hands. Andrew glanced around the crowd and then back at his wife. Melissa was sitting on the edge of the couch, next to some girl in a red dress, but she wasn't talking. Her fingers were slowly sliding down the stem of her glass, and her gaze was downcast. "The rules are simple," Trevor continued. "I spin the bottle, point to a person, they take a task card and complete the task. And no refusals." Everyone clamored, even louder. The atmosphere already resembled something more than just a frivolous party. So, he tilted the bottle sharply, and it swirled on the glass table, making a characteristic tapping sound. Andrew watched as everyone froze in anticipation. The bottle slowed and stopped, pointing at Melissa. "Oh." Trevor grinned. "Well, let's start with you, dear." She raised her head. Her gaze was tense, but her face remained calm. "Come on," he said, holding out the card. Melissa hesitated, then took the slip of paper and read it. Her cheeks turned slightly pink. "Come on, don't drag it out." The girl in red laughed, nudging her with her elbow. Melissa slowly raised her eyes and looked at Trevor. "Sit on the person across from you on your lap," she read, and a cheerful chuckle ran through the crowd. Andrew felt something tighten inside. He abruptly sat up straighter, ready to intervene, but Melissa still didn't move. "Darling, are you really shy?" Trevor said with obvious pleasure in his voice, patting himself on the thigh. "Come here." She cast a brief glance at Andrew. There was something in her eyes. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but he didn't like it. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, she rose slowly from the couch. It was as if the hall held its breath. A step, another, and then she was standing in front of Trevor. "Courage," he encouraged her, a sneer slipping into his voice. She bowed her head and then stepped forward and sat on his lap. Andrew felt the warmth spill down his neck, rise to his face. It was as if a switch had flicked in his head. He watched as his wife settled gingerly into the other man's lap, her body tensing as if she were preparing for something more. Trevor nodded contentedly, his hands sliding lightly to her waist, lingering there a fraction of a second longer than they should have. "Great," he said, addressing everyone. "Well, our game has begun." There was cheering and clapping, and Andrew realized that it was going to be a long night. The living room was filled with drunken laughter, clinking glasses, and loose chatter. The game was gaining momentum, and the tasks were getting bolder. Andrew sat in his chair, watching the whiskey glass in his hand gradually empty, but it didn't help to calm the irritation that was growing by the second. Trevor was running this evening as if he'd rehearsed it in advance, setting the tone, pulling invisible strings, as if he knew exactly who would react and how. The bottle on the glass table made another circle, stopping at Melissa. Everyone turned toward her, as if on cue, waiting for the next move. She looked strange, tense, but not aloof. There was something flickering in her eyes that Andrew couldn't quite make out. He wanted to believe that she'd give up now, just stand up and say she'd had enough. But she didn't. "Oh, this is getting interesting," someone in the crowd piped in. Trevor, of course, smirked. "Great." His voice sounded loud and booming, drawing everyone's attention. "Let's make this harder. How about, well, let's say we kiss." He pretended to think, then nodded at one of the guests, a tall brunette sitting across from him. "Kiss Jared." Laughter erupted. Someone clapped their hands together. Melissa cast a brief glance at her husband again, but said nothing. Andrew felt a strange heaviness growing in his chest. This wasn't just a game. This was something else. "Come on, Melissa," Trevor coaxed. "Or have you decided to blend in?" She exhaled slowly, then stood up and, before Andrew could say anything, took a few steps toward Jared. He smiled and opened his arms slightly, as if inviting her to come closer. Andrew felt something inside him shiver as his wife leaned forward, and Jared, wasting no time, put his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. Their lips met, and damn it, it wasn't a brief, friendly kiss. It was something more, something that couldn't just be written off as innocent fun. He sat forward abruptly, clutching the armrest of his chair, ready to jump up and stop it. But it was as if Trevor sensed his intention. "Hey man, relax," he said, as if nothing had happened. "It's just a game." Andrew looked at him. He was holding steady, with the same smug grin that never seemed to leave his face. When the kiss ended, Melissa pulled away, her face flushed, but she didn't look embarrassed. She silently returned to her seat without meeting her husband's gaze. But that wasn't enough. Of course, Trevor didn't stop there. "Okay, now let's move on to something more serious," he said. "Melissa, I think it's time to add some intrigue. How about we take off, say, your blouse?" Andrew couldn't stay silent any longer. He rose sharply to his feet, ready to cut this circus short. "That's enough. This has gone too far." His voice was sharp, firm. He stepped forward, but before he could take 2 steps, Trevor reached out and put a hand on his shoulder, stopping the movement. Andrew froze. There was something disgustingly calm, calculating in that touch. "Easy, friend," Trevor said quietly, but clearly. "She's just doing her duty. She owes me." The hall was silent for a moment. It was as if someone had turned off the music and muffled all the surrounding noise. Andrew slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting Trevor's. "What the hell kind of duty?" His voice was strained, each word echoing in his temples. All eyes shifted to Melissa. She sat with her head down, her fingers nervously clutching the edge of her skirt. "Oh, so she didn't tell you?" Trevor said mockingly. "I wonder." Someone in the crowd chuckled quietly. Someone whispered, but everyone realized that something really explosive was about to begin. There was a tense silence in the room. Only the muffled music from the speakers on the wall and the faint laughter from the far corner of the house reminded them that this party was still going on. But here, in the center of the living room, everyone froze. The guests glanced around, waiting for the denouement. Andrew felt his heart thudding in his chest, but he couldn't move, couldn't realize what he'd just heard. Trevor stood in front of him, playing with his whiskey glass, his gaze full of indulgent amusement, as if he just told a successful joke. "What did you just say?" Andrew's voice was low, strained. Trevor bowed his head slightly, as if savoring the moment. "I said she owed me," he repeated, keeping his eyes on him. Andrew shifted his gaze to Melissa. She sat with her head down, her fingers nervously clutching the hem of her skirt, her joints white. He expected her to say something back right away, to explain that this was all a stupid joke, that Trevor was just overreacting. But she didn't say anything. "Melissa," his voice dropped to a whisper. She didn't lift her head. "Are you serious?" Melissa clenched her jaws, her chest heaving with frequent breathing. Trevor sighed loudly and looked around the room. Now that it started, why not tell it like it is? "I think my guests will be interested." He took a slow sip of whiskey, savoring it, then set the glass on the table and turned to Andrew. "You see, friend, your wife was once in a bad situation. Very unpleasant. And if it hadn't been for me, let's just say her life might have looked very different. But I helped, just out of the goodness of my heart. Of course, I didn't ask for anything in return." Then, Andrew felt his hands involuntarily clench into fists. "What's the situation?" His voice sounded muffled, as if he were speaking through absorbent cotton. Melissa hissed, but never looked up. "Baby, why don't you tell me?" Trevor grinned, then turned to Andrew again. "No." "Well, then I'll tell you." He took a few steps to the side, as if choosing his words. "She got into a bad story. Someone wanted to get serious with her. Let's just say her reputation was on the line. A marriage. Everything. She made a mistake, a very stupid mistake. And I decided to cover it up. You know, it happens. You help someone, and then you just forget about it. But then I ran into her the other day, and you know what? She remembered." Andrew swallowed hard, feeling his throat dry. "She said she wanted to pay me back," Trevor continued. "Said she felt obligated. And we agreed." He waved his hands theatrically. "That she'd brighten up our evening. It's a fun game, don't you think?" Andrew closed his eyes for a second, trying to digest what he'd heard. He inhaled slowly, then looked at Melissa. Was it true? She raised her head sharply. Her eyes were full of terror, but there was no protest in them. She didn't deny it. She wasn't trying to justify herself. "Andrew," her voice was shaky, barely audible. He took a step closer. "Is it true?" He repeated, feeling the rage inside him, mixed with disgust. Melissa sighed convulsively. I thought I could just fulfill a couple conditions and it would be over." Andrew froze. "Meet the conditions?" He almost laughed, but there was no mirth in that laugh. "Meet the conditions?" She ran her tongue nervously over her lips, lowering her eyes again. "I didn't know it would go this far. But you came here. You sat on his lap. You kissed someone else. And you wanted me to just keep quiet?" She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I didn't want you to find out. I thought I could just what?" He was almost shouting. The room was so quiet. You could hear the ice drops in Trevor's glass slowly melting. "You decided to pay it off this way." His voice trailed off. Melissa flinched. Trevor glared at them with outright derision, his lips quivering with restrained laughter. "God, you guys are like a bad soap opera." "Andrew, relax, buddy. She's almost done. Aren't you proud that your wife is so loyal?" At that moment, something inside Andrew snapped. He realized he could never trust her again. Trevor leaned back in his chair with his arm over the backrest and watched with undisguised pleasure. His eyes burned with excitement, as if he had just won a game that the others didn't even realize they were playing. Well, now that we've started, he looked around the room, stopping at Melissa. The next step is up to you. She flinched, her hands involuntarily clenching into fists. Andrew could see how tense her shoulders were, how she was still hoping someone would stop this nightmare. But no one was going to do it. There were only cheering voices, laughter, applause all around. This was no longer a harmless game. It had become something else. A ritual. A humiliation that everyone had come to see. Come on, baby. Don't stop halfway through. Trevor stretched out, tilting his head to the side. Melissa clenched her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. She didn't want to continue. Andrew could see that. Her eyes. Her gesture said it louder than any words. But something had broken in her the moment she hadn't given up on her first assignment. She was no longer in control of the situation. She was a prisoner in it. Andrew clenched his fists. Come on, don't drag it out. The girl in the red dress, who had been watching with interest from the start, said mockingly. Come on, Melissa, one of the men chimed in. Andrew felt his body literally stiffen with rage. He could no longer sit by and watch his wife slowly cross the line where nothing could be taken back. She doesn't have to do this, he said sharply, taking a step forward. But Trevor didn't even look at him. He just grinned, shook his head, and without changing his relaxed posture, held out his hand as if to reassure him. Andrew, he stretched out with feigned regret. You still don't get it, do you? It's not about responsibilities. It's about promises. And your wife keeps them. Andrew felt his throat tighten. He shifted his gaze to Melissa. Melissa, his voice sounded muffled, strained. She slowly raised her eyes. There was no longer a plea for help in them, only doom. Andrew, but she didn't finish. She knew that any word wouldn't change anything. As if in a dream, as if out of control, she took a slow step forward. It was the step that Andrew feared the most. The step that meant she was no longer resisting. The guests around exploded with cheers of approval. Some clapped their hands, some laughed, some bet on what would happen next. Andrew couldn't take it anymore. Melissa stood in the center of the room with her head down. She knew. Hell, she knew damn well that he was watching, that he was seeing everything, and yet she continued on anyway. Trevor relaxed in his chair, sipping his drink lazily. His gaze spoke more than any words. He was enjoying the sight. Andrew exhaled slowly, took the glass from the table, brought it to his lips, and drank the rest of the whiskey in a gulp. The liquid burned his throat, but he didn't even blink. Then calmly put the glass back, carefully, without unnecessary noise, without sudden movements. You know what? His voice was flat, cold, so icy that those around him instantly fell silent. Have fun without me. He stood up, straightened to his full height, and looked around at the crowd. They looked at him with different expressions, some surprised, some with undisguised interest, some even with respect. But he didn't care anymore. Melissa stepped toward him, her lips quivering, her eyes filled with panic. Andrew. He looked at her, long, hard, studying her, until a few hours ago, this had been his man, his wife, the woman he had once loved more than life. Now someone else stood before him, someone he no longer knew. You didn't just lose my trust, he said, pausing, letting those words crash into her mind. You lost me. There was absolute silence in the room. Even Trevor wasn't smirking anymore. Andrew turned around and, without another word, headed for the exit. He didn't look back. Never looked back again. The door slammed as Melissa entered the house. Her steps were quick, almost tentative, as if she was afraid of what she would see inside. There was a muffled thumping in her chest, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag so tightly that her nails cut into her palm. She looked around. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No sound from the kitchen, where the coffee maker usually rumbled quietly. No dim lights in the bedroom. The air seemed frozen, immovable, as if space had frozen in anticipation. She took a few steps into the living room, then stopped. On the glass table lay a folder. Black, austere. And she knew what was inside before she even opened it. Divorce. The papers were already signed on his part. No explanations, no notes, no angry words. Just a statement of fact. It was over. She sank heavily into her chair, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. It was like a cold stab of reality. She tried to think of what to say to him when he returned, how to explain, how to justify herself. But now that chance was gone. She looked up. The shelves where his books had stood were empty. His jackets were gone in the closet, not a single pair of shoes in the hallway. He wasn't just gone. He erased his presence from this house, from their lives. Her heart racing, she grabbed her phone, flipping through her contacts with trembling fingers. But when she found his number, she froze. What would she say? That he should listen to her? That she needed to explain herself? He'd given her a chance, back there at Trevor's house, but she hadn't taken it. She tossed the phone onto the couch and stood up, suddenly feeling the walls begin to crush her. The house seemed too empty, too big. She walked slowly into the bedroom, peering into the closet out of habit, empty. Everything that had belonged to him was gone. Even his scent, the same light woody aroma that used to hang in the air, was now replaced by sterile silence. Melissa crouched on the edge of the bed, clutching the edge of the plaid. A cold, deafening emptiness settled inside her. She closed her eyes, remembering his voice, remembering the look on his face before he'd left. "You've lost me." Those words echoed in her head. She had lost everything. Andrew sat at the bar, twirling the ring he once wore on his hand on his finger. Now it lay on the table next to an empty glass. He looked at it as if it were something distant, no longer relevant to him. The bartender silently poured another shot of whiskey, but he didn't reach for the glass. Just sat there, staring at the amber liquid, contemplating how damn fast everything you'd built over the years could come crashing down. But he didn't regret it. He let go, and that meant he was free now. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.